The dust-covered pickup truck rumbled to a stop outside Daniel Morgan's modest ranch house, its engine growling like a predator sizing up its prey. 3 men stepped out, their boots crunching on the sun-baked gravel of the Texas Panhandle. Their leader, a tall man with a jagged scar beneath his right eye, flexed his fingers near the modern pistol holstered at his hip. "Well, well," he drawled, eyeing the young man tending to a small herd of cattle in the distance, "if this ain't the most pitiful excuse for a ranch I've ever seen." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling plains of Echo Valley, where Daniel Morgan moved with practiced ease among his small herd. His worn boots and dusty jeans told the story of countless hours spent in these fields, but they revealed nothing of the skills he'd left behind in another life. Sweat glistened on his tanned face as he guided a stubborn calf back to its mother, his movements precise and purposeful. The sound of approaching footsteps made him pause, though he didn't immediately turn around. Even without looking, he could tell by their gait that these weren't the usual ranch hands or neighborly visitors. These steps carried weight, purpose, and something else. Threat. "Morgan!" The scarred man's voice cut through the morning air. "Name's Rex Hawkins. Seems we need to have a conversation about grazing rights." Daniel finally turned, his green eyes taking in the 3 men. Rex stood in front, all swagger and menace, flanked by 2 others, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his neck and a broader figure whose denim jacket barely contained his muscled frame. Their body language spoke of violence barely contained, like rattlers coiled to strike. "My land, my grazing rights," Daniel replied evenly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed at odds with his youthful appearance. "Nothing to discuss." Rex's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "See, that's where you're wrong, boy. Valley's changing, big operations moving in. Can't have little fish like you cluttering up the works." He pulled out a folded document from his jacket. "Got an offer here from Western Range Corporation. They're willing to be generous, for now." Daniel continued his work, guiding another calf with gentle movements. His apparent lack of concern seemed to irritate Rex, whose next words carried a harder edge. 30,000 for the whole spread. More than fair for this dust bowl. Not interested. Daniel's response was calm but firm. "This land's been in my family for 3 generations. The tattooed man spat in the dust. "Ain't gonna be a 4th less you wise up." Daniel's hands stilled on the rope he was coiling. Something in his stance shifted, subtle but significant. Old instincts, carefully buried beneath years of honest ranching work, stirred to life. "That a threat, Mr. Hawkins?" "Just business." Rex's smile didn't reach his eyes. Though funny things tend to happen to folks who don't see reason. Cattle spoke easily, fences break, accidents happen. In the distance, a red-tailed hawk screamed, the sound carrying across the vast expanse of Echo Valley. Daniel watched it circle, remembering other times, other places where he'd faced down threats. Back when they called him the Ghost, the youngest scout sniper in his unit's history, with a skill set that had made him both legendary and dangerous. "I've seen what corporations like Western Range do to small ranchers," Daniel said, turning back to face them fully. "They're not getting my land, or anyone else's in this valley." Rex's hand drifted toward his holster. Awful confidence for a man outnumbered 3 to 1. A tense silence followed, broken only by the lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the prairie grass. Daniel's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, noted every detail. The way the tattooed man's weight shifted forward, how the muscled one's hand disappeared behind his back. "Numbers don't always tell the whole story," Daniel replied, his voice carrying the chill of high mountain winds. "Neither does age. I'd suggest you boys get back in your truck and tell Western Range to look elsewhere." "Or what, cowboy?" The tattooed man stepped forward, pulling a knife from his belt with practiced flair. "Gonna rope us like one of your—" The movement was so fast it seemed impossible. One moment Daniel stood relaxed. The next his rope had snapped out like a striking serpent. The knife went spinning from the tattooed man's grip, and before anyone could react, the same rope had somehow wrapped around his ankles. A quick pull, and he sprawled face first in the dust. Rex's gun cleared leather, but Daniel was already moving. The coiled rope in his hands became a precision tool, striking Rex's wrist with surgical accuracy. The gun dropped unfired as Rex howled in pain. The third man managed to pull his weapon, only to find Daniel impossibly close, inside his guard. A series of precise strikes, learned in another life and perfected through years of practice, left him gasping in the dirt beside his companions. Daniel stood over them, his stance relaxed but ready. Nothing in his previous movements had been rushed or panicked. Each action had flowed into the next with the precision of long practice. "That's quite a trick with that rope," Rex managed, cradling his wrist. "Where'd a rancher learn to move like that?" "Same place where I learned other things." Daniel's voice remained steady. "Things I'd rather not remember or demonstrate." Something in his tone made Rex hesitate. The morning sun caught Daniel's eyes, and for a moment they held the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd seen things these thugs couldn't imagine. "Now," Daniel continued, "I'm going to say this once. The valley's not for sale, not my ranch, not the Henderson place up north, not any of it. You take that message back to your corporate masters." Rex struggled to his feet, helping his dazed companions up. "This ain't over, Morgan." "No," Daniel agreed quietly, "but how it ends is up to you." As the truck roared away in a cloud of dust, Daniel returned to his cattle. But his movements now held a new vigilance, his eyes scanning the horizon with the automatic precision of someone who'd spent years watching for threats through a scope. He'd chosen this quiet life, trading his rifle for a rope, seeking peace in the simple rhythm of ranch work. But some skills couldn't be forgotten, only set aside. In the distance, thunder rolled across the valley, promising rain. Daniel breathed in the coming storm, knowing that more than weather was gathering on his horizon. Western Range Corporation wouldn't stop with one attempt, and Rex Hawkins seemed the type to hold a grudge. Let them come, he thought, guiding his herd toward the shelter of the barn. He'd found something worth protecting here in Echo Valley, not just his land, but a way of life that was vanishing as surely as the old frontier. He'd stood against impossible odds before, in places whose names he tried to forget. He could do it again. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as Daniel secured the barn doors. Inside, he found Sarah Chen, his veterinarian neighbor, examining one of his pregnant heifers. "Though I heard trouble out there," she said without looking up from her work. Her skilled hands moved with practiced efficiency over the cow's swollen belly. "Nothing worth mentioning." Daniel grabbed a brush and began grooming a nervous calf, his movements automatically calming the animal. Sarah straightened, pushing her dark hair back from her face. 3 men in a black pickup? They paid a visit to old Jim Henderson's place yesterday. He called me after they left, scared about his horses. Said they spooked for no reason, right after those men toured his stable. Daniel's jaw tightened. Threatening animals was a time-honored tactic of land grabbers, leaving no evidence but achieving the desired effect on struggling ranchers. Henderson, okay? For now. But he's worried. We all are. Sarah packed her medical bag with precise movements. Valley's changing, Daniel. First the Thompson place sold last spring, then the Whitakers. Now these corporate types are circling what's left. Like vultures. Through the barn's open door, lightning split the sky, followed by a rolling boom of thunder. The storm was getting closer. They went to Martinez first, Sarah continued, referring to the small dairy farm that bordered Daniel's property to the east. Maria said they weren't even subtle about it. Told her a woman alone couldn't possibly manage a working dairy operation. Daniel's hands stilled on the calf. Maria's run that dairy since her husband died in Afghanistan. Does it better than most. They don't care about that, just like they don't care that your family's worked this land since before Texas was a state. Sarah moved closer, her voice dropping. But that's not what really worries me. You hear about the Carsons spread down in Willow Creek? Daniel nodded. The Carson family had refused to sell last month. Fire marshal ruled it an accident. Random electrical short in their barn. Sarah's eyes met his. Funny thing, though. Emily Carson swears she saw someone on their property the night before. Says he had a tattoo on his neck, like one of the men who'd just threatened him. Daniel absorbed this information, adding it to the mental map he was building of the situation. It was a familiar process, one he'd used countless times before in another life, gathering intelligence, identifying patterns, preparing for what was coming. "You still have that shortwave radio set up?" he asked suddenly, preparing and narrating. "This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Sarah blinked at the apparent non sequitur. "Sure, Dad's old ham radio gear. Use it sometimes when the cell towers go down in bad weather. Why? Might need to borrow it sometime." Daniel didn't elaborate, but his mind was already working through contingencies. In his previous life, communication had often meant the difference between success and failure. "Daniel," Sarah's voice was quiet but firm, "I've known you for 5 years. Watch you build this place up from nearly nothing, never asked about before. The way you carry yourself, how you sometimes wake the whole valley with target practice. At dawn, that look you get when military aircraft fly over. Figured everyone's got a right to their privacy." Thunder crashed again, closer now. The pregnant heifer shifted nervously, and Daniel automatically moved to calm her. "But," he prompted, knowing there was more, "but if there's trouble coming, real trouble, the valley needs to know. These aren't just corporate bullies. That man who visited Carson Place, week after the fire, someone saw him meeting with Ray Sullivan." The name hung in the air like gunsmoke. Sullivan was a name whispered in bars and back rooms across 3 counties. Officially a security consultant for various corporations, unofficially, he was known for making problems disappear, sometimes along with the people who caused them. "Appreciate the warning," Daniel said finally, "but it might be safer if you didn't know more." Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Safer? My grandfather came here after Saigon fell with nothing but his veterinary degree and a dream. Built something real. Nobody's taking that from us. Not corporate thugs, not Ray Sullivan, not anyone. So whatever's coming, whatever you're not telling me, just remember you're not alone." She headed for the door, pausing at the threshold. "Oh, and Daniel, next time you do dawn target practice, your second and third shots are always a hair to the left. Might want to work on that." The comment was so unexpected, delivered so casually, that Daniel nearly missed its significance. By the time he processed it, that she'd been paying that much attention, that she could spot such a subtle pattern. Sarah was already gone, her truck's tail lights disappearing into the storm. Daniel stood in the barn doorway, watching the rain sweep across his land. The conversation had shifted something in his calculations. He'd been preparing to handle things alone, as he had in his previous life. But this wasn't a sniper's hide in a distant desert. This was home. The rain drummed on the tin roof as Daniel checked his animals one last time. Tomorrow he'd need to ride his fences, check for damage, and keep up the daily work that ranch life demanded. But tonight, after the storm passed, he had other preparations to make. In a locked trunk beneath his bed lay the tools of his former trade, not just the custom rifle that had made him a legend, but the skills and knowledge that came with it. He'd hoped never to need them again, but hope wasn't a strategy. And if Sullivan was involved, this was already more than a simple land grab. The storm raged outside, but in the barn, surrounded by the quiet sounds of his cattle, Daniel felt a familiar calm settling over him, the kind of calm that preceded difficult decisions and dangerous actions, the kind of calm that had once earned him the nickname Ghost. Dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, the storm's fury replaced by a gentle breeze carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, cleaning his grandfather's old Marlin 336 lever action rifle. The weapon wasn't his specialized equipment from his military days that remained secured away, but it served well enough for ranch work and kept his basic skills sharp. The radio on his counter crackled to life. "Daniel, you up?" Maria. Martinez's voice carried concern even through the static. He reached for the handset. "Here, Maria, everything okay? Got 2 trucks parked at the end of my access road. Been there since sunrise. Black SUVs, tinted windows. They're just watching." Daniel's hand stilled on the rifle. Surveillance was usually the first step in Sullivan's operations. He'd seen the pattern before, in places far from Texas. "Stay inside. I'll swing by after I check my north pasture." "Daniel," Maria hesitated. "My Luis, before Afghanistan, he said if trouble ever came, to ask about someone. Said this man could help if I ever really needed it. Called him the Ghost." The old call sign hit him like a physical blow. He'd worked with Luis Martinez unit once, though Luis had never known his real name. The connection suddenly felt like fate. "Your husband was a good man, Maria. One of the best I served with." The silence on the radio stretched for several heartbeats. "I knew it," she finally whispered. "When you first bought the old Jackson place, something in the way you moved, how you always seemed to know when someone was coming. Luis described you exactly the same way." "Maria..." "Don't worry," she cut him off. "Your secret's safe, but Daniel, they're not just watching my place. Sarah radioed earlier, said there's another SUV up by Henderson's Creek." Daniel absorbed this information, his tactical mind already mapping positions, analyzing patterns. They were establishing a perimeter, documenting routines, professional work. "Thanks for the heads up. Keep your doors locked." He switched off the radio and moved to his window. Sure enough, a glint of metal in the distant tree line caught his eye. Another vehicle partially concealed. They were watching him too. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. Through his screen door, he saw Jake Turner, the teenage son of his nearest neighbor, riding hard across the wet grass. The boy's face was flushed with exertion and fear. "Mr. Morgan!" Jake dismounted in a rush, nearly stumbling. "They shot our dogs. Dad sent me to slow down." Daniel stepped onto his porch, scanning the horizon automatically. Who shot what? 3 men said they were from animal control. Jake's voice shook. Said there'd been complaints about wild dogs attacking cattle. But Rex, he was chained up, and old Blue never hurt anybody. Rex and Blue, the Turner family's guard dogs. Daniel had helped train them himself. They would have been the first warning if anyone tried to slip onto the Turner ranch at night. "Your father knows you rode over?" Jake nodded. "Told me to stay here while he calls the sheriff." "But Mr. Morgan," the boy lowered his voice. "One of them wasn't really animal control. I saw him before at the gas station, talking to that scarred guy who's been around. They didn't know I was watching." Daniel's jaw tightened. They were eliminating security measures, isolating their targets. Standard procedure for what was coming next. You did the right coming here. Daniel led the boy inside. "Call your father on my landline. Tell him to grab what he needs and come here too. Better if we stick together for now." While Jake made the call, Daniel did a quick inventory of his supplies. He'd need to move his tactical gear soon and find a better hiding place. The trunk under his bed wouldn't stay secure if things escalated. The morning wore on, bringing more reports over the radio. Sarah's clinic had been vandalized overnight, medication stolen, equipment smashed. The Hendersons' cattle had somehow gotten loose, despite their gates being padlocked. Small things, adding up to a clear message: no one was safe. By midday, several families had gathered at Daniel's ranch. The Turners brought what food they could. Maria Martinez arrived with her teenage daughter, Elena, who immediately went to help Jake with the horses. Sarah showed up last, her truck loaded with what medical supplies she'd salvaged. "They're pushing harder than I expected," Sarah said quietly, joining Daniel by the window. "Sullivan usually spends weeks on surveillance. Before acting, this feels rushed." Daniel turned to her sharply. "You know Sullivan's methods." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "You're not the only one with a past, Daniel. Before I was a vet, I worked somewhere else. Let's just say I've seen his type before." Another piece clicked into place. Her knowledge of ballistics, her careful attention to details others missed. Daniel had wondered about that. "We're going to need to know everything you know about him later." Sarah nodded toward the drive, where a cloud of dust announced new arrivals. "Company coming." 2 police cruisers rolled up, carrying Sheriff Mike Hawkins, Rex's older brother, and 3 deputies. Daniel had always suspected the sheriff was on Western Range's payroll, but he'd kept his distance, hoping to avoid conflict. That was no longer an option. "Quite a gathering," Hawkins drawled, stepping out of his vehicle. "Any particular reason folks are congregating out here, Morgan?" "Just being neighborly," Daniel replied evenly. "Storm did some damage. People helping." "People." "Uh-huh." Hawkins hooked his thumbs in his belt. "Got some complaints about trespassing. Suspicious vehicles. Thought I'd check it out." "Funny," Sarah spoke up. "We called about those same vehicles earlier. Your office said they'd look into it." "And we did." The sheriff's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Corporate security, all properly licensed. Western Range has every right to protect their interests." "Their interests?" Turner stepped forward, face flushed. "They shot my dogs." Now Mr. Turner, Animal Control, handled that situation. Had complaints about strays threatening livestock. Hawkins held up a hand as Turner started to protest. "But that's not why I'm here. Got word some of you folks have been interfering with corporate employees, making threats." Daniel caught Sarah's subtle headshake. She was right. Engaging. "With Hawkins now would only escalate things." "Nobody's threatening anyone, Sheriff," Daniel said calmly. "But if you're really interested in complaints, I've got documentation of harassment, vandalism, and suspicious activities around several properties. Would you like to make a statement?" Hawkins' face hardened. "Careful, Morgan. Things happen out here in the county. Response times can be mighty slow, if you take my meaning." The threat hung in the air like the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Daniel met the sheriff's gaze steadily, letting just a hint of the ghost show through his calm facade. "They sure can, Sheriff. But you might want to remind your brother that response times work both ways." A tense silence followed, broken only by the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. Finally, Hawkins turned away. "Just keep the peace," he called over his shoulder. "Hate to have to come back out here officially." As the cruisers pulled away, Daniel noticed Sarah studying him with renewed interest. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I once heard a story about a sniper in Afghanistan. They called him the Ghost because no one ever saw him coming. Could put 3 rounds through a pomegranate at 1,000 yards. That's so?" "Mm-hmm. Story goes, he once held off 30 Taliban fighters trying to overrun a village, saved a whole bunch of civilians." She paused. "Including a young army medic who later decided to become a veterinarian." Daniel looked at her sharply, memories suddenly rearranging themselves. Kandahar province, the village with the red walls. Sarah's smile held both recognition and sadness. "Small world, isn't it? Guess we've both been trying to leave the past behind." Before Daniel could respond, Elena Martinez burst out of the house. "Mum, Uncle Carlos is on the radio, says there's men at the dairy saying they're health inspectors. They're trying to force their way in." The gathered ranchers burst into motion, grabbing rifles and heading for trucks, but Daniel held up his hand. "Wait." His voice cut through the chaos. "This is what they want. Get us split up, strung out, make us vulnerable. He turned to Sarah. "Those SUVs that were watching us, they've all moved, probably repositioning for what comes next." "So what do we do?" Turner demanded. "Just let them. Destroy Maria's dairy? No." Daniel's mind was already racing through options, calculating angles and approaches. "We do this smartly. We do this like professionals." He turned to Sarah. "Your clinic overlooks the dairy's south approach, right?" "Clear. View for half a mile," she confirmed. "They'd never expect anyone to be watching from there, not after they vandalized it." "Perfect." Daniel grabbed a map from his kitchen table, spreading it out. The others gathered around as he marked positions with quick, precise strokes. "Maria, you've got that old grain silo on the north end? Empty since last harvest? Good. Turner, how many of your hands can you trust? People who won't spook easy." "4, maybe 5. Boys I served with in the Rangers." Daniel nodded, pieces falling. "Into place. Sarah, get to your clinic. Take Elena. She knows how to use that radio of yours. Keep us updated on movement." He marked 2 more positions. "Turner, split your men between these points. Don't engage unless I give the signal." "What signal?" Jake asked, eager to help despite his father's concerned look. "Trust me, you'll know it." Daniel turned to Maria. "They'll have someone watching your house. Make it look good. Argue with them. Demand paperwork. Buy us time. But stay inside." "What about the rest of us?" Henderson spoke up, his weathered face determined. "Get to high ground here and here." Daniel indicated 2 ridges. "If this goes bad, we'll need covering fire. But no one shoots unless I do first." "Clear?" The ranchers nodded, their expressions a mix of uncertainty and resolve. They weren't soldiers, but they were fighting for their homes. Sometimes that was enough. As the others moved out, Sarah lingered. "You're not just setting up observation posts," she said quietly. "This is a combat spread, standard triangle containment. If you know that, you know what comes next." Daniel checked his rifle, more out of habit than necessity. "Sullivan's men will have a fallback position, probably that abandoned quarry east of the dairy. The one with the perfect view of all access roads?" Sarah's smile was grim. "Already spotted their spotter. Amateur. Keeps catching sun on his scope." Daniel paused in his preparations. "You've been busy." "Like I said, some habits die hard." "Keep an eye on things after the clinic got hit." She hesitated. "Daniel, if this goes wrong." "It won't. But if it does, that thing in Kandahar with the village," her voice dropped lower. "It wasn't just 30 Taliban. There was someone else, someone working with them, a contractor." Daniel's hands stilled. "Sullivan," Sarah nodded. "He was running ops for a private military company, training local militias, or so they claimed. After what happened to the village, he disappeared. Changed companies, changed names, but his methods stayed the same." The revelation settled like lead in Daniel's stomach. Sullivan wasn't just another corporate thug. He was a trained operator who'd seen Daniel work, who might even recognize his tactics. "That's why they're rushing things," he realized. "He knows having a sniper in play changes everything. I want to finish this before I can set it up properly." "Probably." Sarah checked her own weapon, a compact rifle that definitely hadn't come from any civilian dealer. "Good thing he doesn't know there are 2 of us." Before Daniel could respond, Elena's voice crackled over the radio. "Movement at the dairy. 3 vehicles approaching the main gate. They've got some kind of official-looking papers." "Health inspection warrant," Sarah translated. "Standard cover for this kind of operation." Daniel made his final checks. "Get to your position. Channel 3 on the radio if things go bad. And Sarah?" He met her eyes. "Watch the quarry. Sullivan will want a show." She nodded once and was gone, moving with the same fluid grace he remembered from Kandahar. Daniel waited 5 minutes, then slipped out his back door, keeping to the shadows of the tree line. His movements were smooth, unhurried, each step placed with deliberate care, the walk of a man who knew that speed mattered less than silence. The morning sun climbed higher as he made his way to his chosen position, a natural depression that overlooked both the dairy and the quarry. Perfect sightlines, multiple escape routes, good concealment, the kind of spot that had kept him alive in another life. Through his scope, he counted 8 men at the dairy, too many for a simple inspection. Their weapons were concealed but present, visible to his trained eye in the way they moved, how they positioned themselves. Professional work, but not military precision. Hired guns playing soldiers. The radio clicked once, Sarah's signal that she was in position. Another click from the ridge confirmed Turner's men were ready. Now it was a waiting game, a test of patience that would reveal who really held the advantage in Echo Valley. Daniel settled into the familiar stillness of a sniper's hide, his breathing slow and measured. Around him, the valley held its breath, waiting to see if its future would be decided by law or by lead. The choices that had led him here, both in his past life and his present one, seemed to converge on this moment. This time, though, he wasn't a lone operator in hostile territory. This time, he had something worth more than any mission objective. A home, a community, a life he'd built with his own hands. And he'd learned long ago that a man fighting for his home was more dangerous than any hired gun. The sun climbed higher, and Daniel waited, watching through his scope as Sullivan's men began their performance. But there was something in their movements, a tension that suggested they knew they were being watched. Sullivan had taught them well. The question was, had he taught them well enough? The standoff at Maria's dairy ended without bloodshed, but not without consequence. Sullivan's men withdrew after making a show of their inspection, but their message was clear. They could come and go as they pleased, with the law's apparent blessing. That evening, as storm clouds gathered again over Echo Valley, the ranchers regrouped at Daniel's house. The mood was tense, heavy with unspoken questions about what would come next. "They'll be back," Turner said, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. "Probably tonight." Daniel nodded, studying the valley map they'd marked with surveillance positions. "Not at the dairy. That was just theater, letting us see them operate. In the open, the real move will be somewhere else. The reservoir." Sarah's voice drew everyone's attention. She stood by the window, her posture revealing her military background despite her civilian clothes. "Controls water for half the valley. Sullivan's favorite tactic, cut off resources, make defenders react emotionally." Maria clutched her coffee cup tighter. "How can you be sure?" "Because that's what he did in Kandahar." Sarah's eyes met Daniel's. "Cut off the village's water supply, waiting for people to get desperate. When they sent men to fix it..." She didn't need to finish. The room fell silent, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Daniel moved to the map, marking the reservoir's location with a red X. 2 access roads, he noted, plus the maintenance trail along the pipeline. 3 points of approach, Sarah confirmed. Classic ambush setup. Henderson cleared his throat. "Sheriff's got deputies patrolling up there. Says they're protecting infrastructure." "They're spotters," Daniel corrected. "Eyes for Sullivan's team, making sure we don't get there first." Eleanor, who had been quietly monitoring the radio, suddenly straightened. "Movement on the North Road. 2 SUVs heading toward the reservoir. And, something else. A bigger vehicle." "Tanker truck," Sarah guessed. "They're not just going to cut off the water. They're going to poison it. Make it look like an accident. Contamination from illegal dumping." The ranchers erupted in angry shouts, but Daniel held up his hand. "This is good." "Good," Turner exploded. "How are they poisoning our water supply? Because now we know how they play." Daniel's voice remained calm, measured. "And because they've made a mistake. Sullivan's getting impatient, moving too fast. Probably pressure from his corporate bosses." He turned to the group, his green eyes intense. "Think about it. A tanker truck means they need time to set up, pump whatever they're using into the reservoir. Can't do that quietly, can't do it quickly, and they'll need their perimeter teams in place first." Understanding dawned on Sarah's face. They'll have to stage their men before the tanker arrives, set up their positions in advance. Exactly. Daniel began marking points on the map, which means we can get ahead of them, but we'll need to move now and we'll need to split up. The next hour was a flurry of preparation. Daniel divided the ranchers into teams, each with specific objectives. Turner and his former ranger hands would secure the maintenance trail. Henderson and 3 others would cover the south access road. Sarah, who proved to be as skilled with tactical planning as she was with veterinary medicine, would coordinate. From her clinic's vantage point, "What about me?" Jake asked, his young face determined. Daniel considered the boy. He saw the same eagerness, the same desire to prove himself that he'd once seen in young soldiers. But he also saw something else, a natural awareness of his surroundings, the way he instinctively noted escape routes and cover positions. "I need someone I can trust to run our radio net," Daniel said finally. "Someone who knows every inch of this valley and can keep track of everyone's movements." "Think you can handle that?" Jake's chest swelled with pride. "Yes, sir, but what about you? Where will you be?" Daniel checked his rifle one last time, not his military weapon. That would come later if needed. But his grandfather's old Marlin. Sometimes the tools you grew up with were the ones you trusted most. "I'm going to have a conversation with an old acquaintance." The storm broke just as they moved out, rain providing natural cover for their approach. Daniel made his way through the darkness with the fluid grace of long practice, each step silent despite the wet ground. The reservoir loomed ahead, its surface churned by rain and wind. Through his scope, he counted Sullivan's advance team, 6 men, professional gear, moving with military precision. They were good, he had to admit, but they were fighting for a paycheck. He was fighting for something more. The radio clicked twice in his ear. Sarah's signaled that the perimeter teams were in position. Another click from Jake confirmed all channels were clear. Now came the waiting, the perfect stillness that had once earned him his call sign. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in stark relief. Daniel caught glimpses of Sullivan's men setting up their positions, their movements betraying their training. Former special forces, probably. Good men who'd chosen the wrong side of this fight. Then he saw him, Ray Sullivan himself, directing operations from the cover of a maintenance shed. He looked different from Kandahar, grayer and heavier, but his movements held the same calculated efficiency. He was scanning the darkness, not with night vision gear like his men, but with the naked eye of someone who knew what to look for. Daniel keyed his radio once. The prearranged signal. Across the reservoir, hidden lights began to wink on, the ranchers' trucks positioned to illuminate the entire area. Sullivan's men froze, caught in the sudden glare. "Smart," Sullivan's voice carried across the water. "Very smart. Ghost, is that you out there?" Daniel remained silent, watching through his scope as Sullivan's men tried to adapt to their exposed positions. "You know, I wondered about you after Kandahar," Sullivan continued. "Not many men could have made those shots. Even fewer would have walked away afterward, disappeared into civilian life." He paused, scanning the darkness. "But here you are, playing cowboy in Texas. Small world." Lightning flashed again, and Daniel caught the glint of something in Sullivan's hand, not a weapon, but a detonator. His blood ran cold as he realized what they'd missed. "Sarah," he whispered into his radio, "check the pipeline. They've had days to set this up. The tanker's a diversion." He heard her sharp intake of breath, then the sound of movement as she repositioned her scope. "Charges," she confirmed seconds later. "Professional setup. They're not going to poison the water. They're going to destroy the whole system." Sullivan's voice rang out again. "You've got about 2 minutes before my men finish their final checks. After that, well, I'd start thinking about how you're going to explain to your rancher friends why their water supply is suddenly distributed across half the valley." Daniel's mind raced. The charges would be redundant, multiple triggers. Taking out Sullivan wouldn't stop them. But maybe. "Jake," he whispered into his radio, "remember that story about your grandfather's bridge, the one the Germans tried to blow in World War II? "Yes, sir," the boy replied, confusion clear in his voice. "He led a patrol that—" "Wait, the Transformers?" "Exactly. Tell Henderson's team. They'll know what to do." Daniel shifted his position slightly, using the storm's cover to circle around behind Sullivan's position. The man was good. He had to admit, keeping his back to the maintenance shed, controlling sightlines, staying just visible enough to draw attention while his men worked. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed Daniel was still the same sniper from Kandahar, looking for the perfect shot. He hadn't counted on what 5 years of ranch work could teach a man about improvisation. The first hint Sullivan had that something was wrong was the sound of electricity arcing through the wet air. The reservoir's power station, which pumped water to the outlying ranches, suddenly lit up like daylight. The surge traveled through the wet ground, through the hastily laid detonation wires, frying delicate electronics before Sullivan's men could react. Daniel's voice finally cut through the darkness. "You forgot something, Ray. Out here, we don't just worry about water. We worry about lightning, too." The explosion, when it came, was nothing like Sullivan had planned. Instead of the reservoir's pipeline bursting, it was the charges themselves that detonated prematurely, made unstable by the electrical surge. The blast was contained, controlled, damaging nothing but Sullivan's own equipment. In the chaos that followed, Daniel emerged from the darkness like his old namesake. But he wasn't the same man Sullivan had known in Kandahar. This wasn't about a perfect shot or a mission objective. This was about protecting home. "It's over, Ray," Daniel called out, his voice carrying across the reservoir's churning surface. "Your charges are dead. Your men are exposed. And the sheriff's deputies you posted, they've got some interesting company." As if on cue, floodlights blazed from the access road. 2 state police cruisers had quietly joined the sheriff's patrol, their lights casting blue and red reflections across the water. Sarah's connections, Daniel realized. She'd been busy while he was setting up his approach. Sullivan's laugh held no humor. "You think some local cops change anything? I've got judges in my pocket, politicians on speed dial. This isn't the sandbox anymore, Ghost. Different rules here." "You're right." Daniel moved closer, staying in the shadows, but letting Sullivan track his movement. "Different rules, different stakes. Back there, we were fighting for somebody else's cause. Here?" He gestured at the valley spreading out below. "And them. This is our home, our land, our water." Very touching. Sullivan's hand moved slightly, and Daniel caught the glint of another device. A backup trigger. "But sentiment doesn't change economics. This valley's worth millions in development rights. Water rights alone." A shot rang out so precise it seemed to split the raindrops. The device in Sullivan's hand exploded into fragments, leaving him clutching a bleeding finger. "That wasn't me," Daniel said quietly. Through his radio, he heard Sarah's soft chuckle. "Like I said, different rules. We protect our own here." Sullivan's men were shifting uneasily now, reading the changing situation. They were professionals, but they were also survivors. They could see the lights moving on the ridgeline, more ranchers arriving, drawn by Jake's radio calls. "Stand down," Daniel advised them. "As I hear it, Western Range isn't great about paying legal fees or bail." One by one, Sullivan's operators lowered their weapons. They were mercenaries after all, no point dying for a corporate land grab. But Sullivan himself remained defiant. "You've changed, Ghost," he spat. "Gone soft. Time was, you'd have taken the shot, ending the threat permanently. Now look at you, playing cowboy, making speeches about home and community." Maybe. Daniel emerged fully from the shadows, his rifle held ready but not aimed. "Or maybe I Finally learned what's worth fighting for, what's worth not fighting for, too. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark relief. Sullivan stood alone now, his men already being zip-tied by Turner's Rangers. State police were moving in, documenting the explosive charges, gathering evidence that no amount of political connections could easily explain away. You really think this ends here? Sullivan's voice was quiet, dangerous. Western Range has deeper pockets than you can imagine. They'll just send someone else, someone worse. Maybe. Sarah materialized from the darkness, her own rifle trained steadily on Sullivan. But they'll find the same thing you did, a community that stands together, and a couple of old ghosts who remember how to fight. The rain was easing now, the storm moving east. Daniel could see lights coming on in distant ranch houses as word spread. This night would be remembered in Echo Valley, not just for what had happened, but for what it represented. One last thing, Ray. Daniel moved closer, his voice dropping so only Sullivan could hear. That village in Kandahar, the one you helped, set up for slaughter? Their families got out, every single one. While you were watching the water supply, I was getting them to safety. Just like tonight, sometimes the obvious target is just a distraction. Sullivan's face went pale as the full implications hit him. His reputation, his perfect record of village pacification, had been built on a lie. And now he had failed again, in front of witnesses, with evidence scattered all around him. As the state police led Sullivan away, Daniel felt the tension of the past weeks finally begin to ease, but he knew this wasn't really the end, just a beginning. Echo Valley had changed tonight. Its people had discovered something about themselves, about what they could accomplish together. Sarah joined him by the reservoir's edge, where the first hints of dawn were starting to paint the sky. Think they'll really send someone else? Probably. Daniel watched the cleanup operation unfolding around them. But next time we'll be ready. All of us. Together, she agreed, then smiled. You know, for a ghost, you're getting pretty good at being part of a community. Daniel looked out over the valley he'd chosen as his home. Lights were coming on in ranch houses as the news spread. Cars and trucks were moving on the roads as people came to help with the cleanup. This wasn't the solitary life he'd imagined. When he'd left his old world behind, it was something better. Speaking of community, Sarah continued, Maria's organizing breakfast at the dairy. Whole valley's invited. Sort of a celebration, I guess. Or maybe just a reminder of what we're fighting for. Daniel nodded, finally letting himself feel the bone-deep weariness of the night's events. But it was a good tired, the kind that came from protecting something worthwhile. Guess we should make an appearance, he said. After all, that's what neighbors do. They walked back together through the lightning darkness, leaving behind the reservoir that had almost become a battlefield. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, corporate lawyers, political pressure, maybe worse. But tonight had proved something important. Echo Valley wasn't just a collection of ranches anymore. It was a community. And communities, like the best tactical positions, were built to withstand storms. 3 days after the reservoir standoff, Echo Valley was still buzzing with activity. News vans lined the main road, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like metal sunflowers. Corporate lawyers in expensive suits prowled the courthouse, while environmental inspectors combed the reservoir for evidence of Western Range's attempted sabotage. Daniel watched it all from the comfort of his front porch, cleaning his grandfather's rifle with practiced ease. The media had tried to interview him, of course, but he'd let Sarah handle that part. She had a way with words he'd never mastered, and besides, her story about a veterinarian organizing local resistance played better than his background. Channel 7's running another special tonight, Jake reported, bringing Daniel his morning coffee. The boy had appointed himself unofficial intelligence officer for the valley, keeping track of who came and went. They're calling it the Battle for Echo Valley. Bit dramatic, Daniel murmured, though he had to admit it made for good headlines. Any word from the state capital? The governor's office is launching an investigation into Western Ranges land dealings. The FBI's involved now too, something about interstate corruption. Daniel nodded, unsurprised. Sullivan's capture had opened a Pandora's box of corporate misdeeds, but experience had taught him that powerful entities rarely fell without a fight. The radio on his porch crackled. "Daniel?" Maria's voice carried an edge he hadn't heard since the night at the reservoir. "We've got visitors at the dairy. Different. Kind this time." He was already moving before she finished speaking. "What kind of difference?" "Military. 2 men in civilian clothes. But I know that stance anywhere. They're asking about Kandahar." Daniel's hand stilled on his rifle. He'd been expecting this ever since Sullivan's arrest. Some stories couldn't stay buried forever. "On my way." "Sarah?" "Already here." Her voice joined the conversation. "They're legit, Daniel. Defense Intelligence Agency. I recognize one of them from before." The drive to Maria's dairy took exactly 6 minutes, each second filled with calculations and contingencies. Daniel had learned long ago that when intelligence agencies came calling, they rarely brought good news. He found Sarah waiting by the dairy's front gate, her posture deceptively relaxed. The 2 visitors stood near their unmarked car, one older with silver hair and a weathered face, the other younger but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of special operations. "Lieutenant Morgan," the older man greeted him. "Or do you prefer Mr. Morgan these days?" "Daniel's fine." He studied them carefully. "Long way from Washington." "That it is." The man offered his hand. "Colonel James, Fletcher, DIA, my colleague Major Chen." Daniel shook their hands but didn't invite them inside. Some conversations were better had in the open. "You're a hard man to find," Fletcher continued. "After Kandahar, you disappeared pretty thoroughly. Change your name, build a new life. Can't say I blame you after what happened." "That file's classified," Daniel said quietly. "Was classified," Major Chen corrected. "Things have changed. Sullivan's arrest kicked over some interesting rocks. People in high places are asking questions about what really happened in that village." Sarah moved closer, her presence a silent support. She knew most of the story, had been there for parts of it, but even she didn't know everything. "The official record shows a failed operation," Fletcher said. 30+ insurgents killed, civilian casualties, critical intelligence lost. But that's not what really happened, is it? Daniel's mind flashed back to that night. The village with its red walls, the families he'd helped escape through ancient tunnels, while Sullivan's men watched the obvious routes. The carefully staged evidence suggesting a massacre when, in reality, those people needed a way out, he said finally. Sullivan's company was using them, setting them up to take the fall for opium shipments. When they refused to cooperate, he was going to make an example of them, Sarah finished, like he tried to do here. Fletcher nodded grimly. "We know. What we didn't know was how they escaped. Not until Sullivan started talking, trying to cut a deal. He seemed particularly interested in making sure certain people knew about a sniper called the Ghost." "That's not who I am anymore," Daniel said firmly. "No," Chen agreed. "You're not. You're something more interesting now. A community leader, someone who found a different way to fight." Fletcher pulled a folder from his car. "That's actually why we're here. Sullivan wasn't just working for Western Range. He was part of a larger organization, private military contractors who've been manipulating land deals across 3 continents, using skills and tactics learned in places like Kandahar to pressure local populations." Daniel's tactical mind quickly grasped the implications. Echo Valley wasn't their only target, not even close. Fletcher spread out a map on the hood of his car. Red dots marked dozens of locations across the American Southwest. Every mark represents a community facing similar pressure. Corporate buyouts backed by intimidation, environmental sabotage, and corrupt local officials. And you want my help. It wasn't a question. We want to offer you a job, Chen corrected. Official capacity this time, training local communities to resist these tactics legally and effectively. What you did here in Echo Valley, organizing defense, gathering evidence, building community resistance, it could be a model. Sarah's sharp intake of breath matched Daniel's own surprise. This wasn't what he'd expected when he'd seen government vehicles rolling up. "What's the catch?" he asked. Fletcher's smile was understanding. "No catch. You choose the assignments, work on your own terms. Keep your ranch, keep your life here. We just provide resources, intelligence, and legal backup when needed. And official cover," Chen added. "No more hiding who you are or what you can do." Daniel looked out over the valley he'd come to call home. Morning sun painted the hills gold. Cattle grazed peacefully in distant fields, and the community he'd helped build was stronger than ever. But there were other communities out there, facing the same threats, needing the same help. "I'll need to think about it," he said finally. "Of course." Fletcher handed him a secure phone. "Take your time, but be aware, Sullivan's organization is already regrouping. They'll have learned from their failure here. Next time, they'll be better prepared." As the agents drove away, Sarah studied Daniel's expression. "You're actually considering it." "Wouldn't have to travel far," he mused. "Most of these marks are within a day's drive. Could help other communities set up their own defense networks, teach them what we learned here. Sarah emphasized, "if you're doing this, you're not doing it alone. Valley's got your back now." The radio crackled again. Jake's voice this time, excitement clear in his tone. "Mr. Morgan, Henderson spotted one of Sullivan's old trucks heading into Carson County. Looks like they're already starting trouble with the ranchers there." Daniel shared a look with Sarah, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. Some battles couldn't be walked away from. Some fights were worth taking on. And sometimes the best way to protect your home is to help others protect theirs. "Tell Henderson to keep eyes on that truck," he replied. "And Jake, get Turner on the radio. Looks like Echo Valley might need to show our neighbors how we handle corporate bullies around here." The morning sun climbed higher as Daniel and Sarah drove back to his ranch, plans already forming. They had work to do, not just protecting what they'd built, but helping others build something similar. The Ghost had found a new mission, and this time he wasn't working alone. Back at the ranch, they found Turner and his former rangers already gathered, along with several other valley residents who'd proven their worth during the reservoir confrontation. Henderson had brought detailed maps of Carson County, while Maria contributed her knowledge of the local ranching families. "Carson County's different from here," Henderson explained, spreading out a topographical map. "More spread out, less natural coverage. Sullivan's people will have easier sight lines. But harder time coordinating," Sarah pointed out. "Those open spaces work both ways." Daniel studied the terrain, his trained eye picking out defensive positions and potential trouble spots. "What do we know about the local sheriff?" Pat Russell, Turner supplied, "served with him in Iraq. Straight shooter but understaffed and underfunded. County's been struggling since the drought 3 years back. Perfect target for corporate vultures," Maria added bitterly. "Same playbook they tried here. Pressure the weakest points first, divide the community." Jake burst in, waving a printout. "Just got this from my friend at the county clerk's office. Western Range hasn't just been buying land, they've been purchasing water rights all through the Carson River watershed." Daniel examined the document, noting familiar patterns. They're not just after ranch land, they're trying to control the entire region's water supply. "Setting up for something bigger," Sarah agreed. "Question is, do we have legal standing to intervene?" As if in answer, Fletcher's secure phone buzzed. The message was brief, but clear. "Carson County Sheriff requesting assistance corporate land fraud. Official invitation to consult. All. Resources authorized. A slow smile spread across Daniel's face. Looks like we just got jurisdiction. The next hour was spent in careful planning. This wouldn't be like Echo Valley. They couldn't simply replicate their previous tactics. But they could adapt to them, improve them, and teach others to build their own resistance. We'll need local contacts, Daniel began. People who know the territory, the community dynamics. Jake, your network of friends at the county offices could be crucial. The boy nodded eagerly. Already got people watching key locations. That truck Henderson spotted? It stopped at the Double B Ranch, belonging to Bill Branson, one of the biggest holdouts against Western Range. Maria, can you reach out to the dairy farmers there? They'll trust you more than government agents. Already ahead of you, she smiled. Got a cousin married to Branson's daughter. Been meaning to pay them a visit anyway. Sarah studied the satellite imagery Fletcher had provided. They've got men watching the main access roads, but they're sloppy. Amateur hour compared to Sullivan's crew. New team, Daniel surmised. Probably local muscle for now, while they rebuild their professional ranks. But that could change fast. Turner cleaned his rifle thoughtfully. Could be an advantage. Local. Boys might think twice about strong-arming their neighbors once they realize the whole community's watching. Speaking of watching, Henderson interrupted, got movement on the county line. 3 more vehicles heading in, these ones looking more professional. Black SUVs, tinted windows. Daniel checked his watch. Word of their involvement must have reached Western Range's new management faster than expected. Good. Let them know. They were being watched, that their tactics wouldn't go unchallenged. Sarah, take Turner and set up observation posts here and here. He marked positions on the map. Jake, get your friends to spread the word. Any suspicious activity gets reported immediately. Maria, time to visit that cousin. What about you? Sarah asked, though her slight smile suggested she already knew. Daniel checked his rifle, not the family Marlin this time, but the custom weapon he'd kept locked away for so long. Some situations called for sending a clearer message. Think. I'll pay Sheriff Russell a visit. He knows what kind of help he's really getting. As the others moved out, each with their assigned tasks, Sarah lingered. You know what this means, right? Taking this official, stepping back into the light. There's no going back to being just a rancher. Daniel looked out over his land, where cattle grazed peacefully under the Texas sun. Maybe not, but maybe that's not such a bad thing. Every skill I learned as the ghost, every lesson from building this place up, it all led here, to help others fight back the right way. Building something instead of just destroying, she nodded. Though I have to admit, destroying Sullivan's operation was pretty satisfying. A radio call from Jake interrupted them. Mr. Morgan, got something weird here? Those SUVs, they're not heading to Branson's place. They're splitting up, moving to cover the county water testing stations. Daniel and Sarah shared a knowing look. Some tactics never changed, but this time, the defenders would be ready before the first move was made. Tell Russell we're incoming, Daniel replied. And Jake, remember what we learned at the reservoir. Sometimes the obvious threat is just a distraction. They drove toward Carson County, under a sky that seemed bigger somehow, full of possibility rather than threat. The ghost was riding again, but not as a solitary figure in the darkness. This time, he moved in daylight, backed by a community that understood its own strength, ready to help others find theirs. Western Range and their corporate allies were about to learn a hard lesson. You couldn't fight a ghost, especially one who'd found something worth haunting. Carson County Sheriff. Pat Russell wasn't what Daniel had expected. The man's office was a cluttered mix of modern law enforcement technology and old-school ranch practicality. Tactical vests hung alongside worn leather gun belts, and a state-of-the-art computer sat beside a battered coffee maker that had probably seen service since the Carter administration. "So you're the ghost," Russell said without preamble. He was a lean man with sun-weathered skin and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Turner told me you were good. Didn't mention you'd bring an entire valley's worth of backup. Better to have It and not need it, Daniel replied, noting how Russell's hand stayed casually close to his sidearm. Old habits die hard in their line of work. True enough. Russell tapped a thick file on his desk. Got something you should see. Been building this case for months, but couldn't get anyone to listen. Not until Echo Valley made headlines. The file contained photographs, documents, and handwritten notes, evidence of a pattern that went beyond simple corporate land grabs. Western Range's new management had learned from Sullivan's mistakes, operating with more subtlety, but no less determination. They're targeting infrastructure first, Russell explained. Water testing stations, power substations, communications repeaters. Taking control of the systems people depend on before they make their big moves. Sarah, who'd been silently studying a wall map, spoke up, creating leverage without obvious threats. Harder to prove, harder to fight. Exactly. Russell stood, moving to the map. Last week, 3 ranches reported problems with their well water. Tests showed contamination, but county inspectors couldn't find the source. Yesterday, the only lab certified to do independent testing announced it's being bought out by a subsidiary of Western Range. Daniel examined the map, noting how the affected ranches formed a pattern. They're isolating Branson's spread, cutting off his options before they make their pitch. Bill Branson's not the type to sell, Russell said grimly. His family's worked that land since before the Civil War, but his daughter's expecting their first grandchild, and with the water situation, the implied threat was clear and more insidious than Sullivan's brutal tactics. No violence, no obvious coercion, just the slow strangulation of resources until selling seemed like the only option. Your county water commissioner, Sarah asked suddenly. Angela Chen, any relation? Russell's eyebrows rose. Her father was in the Army Corps of Engineers, served in Vietnam. Why? A slight smile crossed Sarah's face. Think I just found our way in. Daniel, remember that training program we discussed? Might be time to implement it early. Before Daniel could respond, a young deputy burst into the office. Sheriff, got reports of unmarked vehicles at 3 different water testing stations. They're claiming to be from the State Environmental Office, but their credentials don't match any records we can find. Russell was already moving, strapping on his tactical vest. How many men? 2 teams of 4 at each site, professional equipment, but they're not trying very hard to look like actual environmental inspectors. They want to be seen, Daniel realized. Want us focused on the obvious threat while something else happens. Sarah was already on her secure phone, coordinates flying between her and Jake's network of observers. Movement at the old railroad depot, she reported. Trucks coming in from the north, big ones. Tanker trucks? Russell asked, remembering Echo Valley's reservoir incident. No. Sarah's voice was grim. Drilling equipment. They're not going to contaminate the water. They're going to redirect it, tap into the aquifer upstream from Branson's ranch. Daniel's mind raced through options. This wasn't like the reservoir confrontation. They couldn't simply overwhelm the opposition with superior numbers and positioning. The enemy had learned, adapted, and spread their resources too thin for a direct response. Jake, he spoke into. His radio, what assets do we have in place? Turner's team is watching the depot. Henderson's people have eyes on 2 of the testing stations. Maria made contact with Branson. He's got hands ready to move, just waiting on word. And our other resource? A new voice joined the channel, Fletcher from the DIA. Satellite coverage is active. Ground-penetrating radar shows they've already started preliminary drilling at 2 locations. The Environmental Protection Agency is very interested in their permits, or lack thereof. Russell whistled softly. You folks don't mess around. Can't afford to, Daniel replied. Not with people's lives at stake. He turned to the map, marking positions with quick, precise movements. Here's what we're going to do. The plan came together with military precision. But this wasn't a military operation. It was something new, a blend of community defense, legal action, and tactical pressure that Daniel had begun developing in Echo Valley. Turner's Rangers would handle the drilling sites, not with violence, but with cameras and environmental testing equipment. Every violation would be documented, every worker's credentials checked, every piece of equipment serial number recorded. Henderson's team, supplemented by Russell's deputies, would maintain a visible presence at the water testing stations. Let Western Range's people know they were being watched, their movements tracked, their activities scrutinized. Maria and Sarah would coordinate with local ranchers, establishing a network of observers and information sharing that would outlast this immediate crisis. The community's eyes and ears would become its strongest defense. But the key element, the move that would change everything, came from an unexpected source. Got something? Jake's excited voice crackled over the radio. Remember how I said Western Range bought that testing lab, found their paperwork? The lab's chief technician quit last week, took copies of all their results before the sale went through, says the contamination tests were altered. Russell's eyes lit up. That's criminal fraud, federal offense when it involves water safety. Better than that, Sarah added, hanging up her phone. Angela Chen just confirmed the aquifer they're trying to tap connects to protected wetlands. EPA jurisdiction. Daniel smiled grimly. Western Range had learned from Sullivan's mistakes, moved away from brute force tactics, but in trying to operate within the system, they'd made themselves vulnerable to that same system. Time to move, he announced. But first, he turned to Russell. Sheriff, how do you feel about a press conference? Russell blinked. Press conference. Sullivan's operation failed, partly because it happened in darkness. This time, we do everything in the light. Let the whole county see what's happening, who's really protecting their interests. Understanding dawned on Russell's weathered face. Make it impossible for them to operate in shadows because there won't be any shadows left. Exactly. Daniel checked his weapon, not to use it, but to remind himself of what it represented. The ghost had been a shadow warrior once, but now his greatest weapon was visibility. Jake, get those documents to the EPA and FBI. Sarah, coordinate with Angela Chen. We need official water quality tests from every affected ranch. Turner, maintain observation, but do not engage. Let them see us watching. Let them wonder what else we know. And you? Sarah asked, though her smile suggested she knew the answer. Daniel walked to the window, looking out over the Carson County Courthouse Square, where news vans were already beginning to arrive. Word of Echo Valley's defenders coming to help had spread faster than even Jake's efficient network could account for. Think it's time the ghost stopped being a ghost, he said quietly. Time to show them what happens when communities stand together. In broad daylight, the next few hours would reshape Carson County's future, not through violence or intimidation, but through the combined strength of law, community, and strategic thinking. Western Range had evolved beyond Sullivan's crude tactics, but they hadn't counted on their opponents evolving too. The ghost was about to teach them a new kind of warfare, fought not with bullets and blood, but with cameras and court orders, public pressure and community solidarity, and in doing so, he would complete his own evolution, from solitary sniper to community defender, from shadow warrior to leader in the light. The courthouse steps were crowded by the time Daniel and Sheriff Russell emerged. Local ranchers stood shoulder to shoulder with environmental activists who'd rushed in from the state capitol. News cameras pointed at the podium like artillery. "In pieces," while satellite trucks hummed in the background. "Sure about this?" Russell asked quietly. "Once you step into those lights, there's no going back to anonymity." Daniel adjusted his collar. Sarah had insisted he wear a proper shirt for the cameras. Some things are worth sacrificing privacy for. He scanned the crowd with practiced ease, noting positions, analyzing threats. Turner's men were scattered throughout, alert but inconspicuous. Henderson's team had taken up positions on nearby rooftops, not with rifles this time, but with cameras of their own, documenting everything. But the real power wasn't in the security. It was in the faces of the crowd. Ranchers who'd been fighting alone suddenly found themselves part of something larger. Community members who'd felt helpless against corporate pressure saw a path to resistance that didn't require violence. Russell stepped to the microphone first, his voice carrying across the square with quiet authority. He laid out the basic facts: the suspicious water tests, the fraudulent lab results, the illegal drilling operations. Each point was backed by documentation, every accusation supported by evidence. Then came Angela Chen, the water commissioner, armed with charts and geological surveys showing how Western Range's drilling would impact the entire region's water table. Her technical expertise gave weight to the emotional appeals that followed, ranchers describing how their families had worked this land for generations, parents worried about their children's future. Throughout it all, Daniel watched the edges of the crowd. He spotted Western Range's observers easily enough, too well-dressed for ranch country, too stiff in their attempts to look casual. They were recording everything, probably live streaming back to corporate headquarters. Good. Let them see. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel stepped forward without hesitation. The skills that had once made him a legend in combat now served a different purpose. Reading the crowd, adjusting his tone, finding the words that would resonate beyond this moment. Most of you know me as the rancher from Echo Valley who helped stop Sullivan's operation, he began. Some of you might have heard other names for me from other times and places. Today, I'm here as something else, a neighbor who's seen what happens when communities stand divided and what's possible when they stand together. He detailed the pattern they'd uncovered, not just in Carson County, but across the region. Corporate interests using sophisticated tactics to pressure landowners, control resources, and reshape communities to their benefit. But they made a mistake, he continued, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the square. They thought if they avoided Sullivan's brutal methods, if they worked through legal channels and corporate subsidiaries, they'd be untouchable. They forgot that the law cuts both ways, that communities can learn and adapt just like corporations do. As if on cue, a convoy of EPA vehicles rolled into view, followed by FBI units. Jake's evidence had hit home faster than expected. Daniel caught Sarah's slight smile. She'd timed it perfectly. Right now, federal agents are serving warrants at 3 drilling sites and 2 corporate offices, he announced. They're armed, with evidence provided by this community, everyday people who chose to watch, to document, to stand together against corruption. The crowd stirred as more vehicles arrived. State environmental officials, water quality inspectors, even a team from the Army Corps of Engineers. The full weight of regulatory authority was descending on Carson County, sparked by one community's refusal to be silenced. But Daniel wasn't finished. To those watching from Western Range, I have a message. This isn't just about Carson County. Every community you've targeted, every ranch you've pressured, every resource you've tried to control, they're all watching. You're now learning, organizing. He gestured to the gathered crowd. Look around, ranchers standing with environmentalists, local law enforcement working with federal agencies, neighbors helping neighbors. This is what real strength looks like. Not corporate power, not legal manipulation, but communities united in protecting what matters. As he stepped back from the microphone, Daniel caught movement at the edge of the square. Western Range's observers were already pulling out phones and calling in reports. They'd come expecting to monitor a simple press conference. Instead, they'd witnessed the launch of something much larger. Sarah joined him as the crowd began to disperse, the news crews rushing to cover the multiple raids happening across the county. Nice speech. Almost makes me forget you used to communicate. Primarily through a scope, People change, he replied, watching FBI agents escort Western Range's drilling crew away from the depot. Communities too. Speaking of change. She handed him a tablet displaying messages from across the region. Other communities facing similar pressure were reaching out, asking for help, offering support. The network they'd begun building was already growing beyond Carson Country's borders. Looks like the ghost is going to be busy, she observed. Daniel thought about the secure phone Fletcher had given him, about the map showing similar situations across the Southwest. But he also thought about his ranch in Echo Valley, about the life he'd built there. We'll be busy, he corrected. This isn't a one-man operation anymore. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse square as they walked back to their vehicles. Behind them, the machinery of justice ground into motion. Search warrants executed, evidence collected, corporate schemes exposed to daylight. But the real victory wasn't in the raids or arrests. It was in the conversations happening among the dispersing crowd, the connections being formed, the knowledge being shared. Western Range had tried to divide and conquer, but they'd inadvertently created something powerful, a template for resistance that could be replicated anywhere. Jake was waiting by Daniel's truck, practically bouncing with excitement. You should see the messages coming in, Mr. Morgan. Ranchers from 3 states want to know how we set up our observation network. Environmental groups are offering to help train more water monitors. There's even a law school clinic wanting to document our methods as a case study. Daniel smiled at the boy's enthusiasm, remembering his own journey from solitary warrior to community leader. Guess we'd better start writing some of this down. Can't be everywhere at once. Don't have to be, Sarah pointed out. That's the beauty of it. Teach people to defend themselves. Connect them with others who can help. Give them the tools and knowledge to stand together. The ghost becomes more than a person, it becomes a movement. As they drove back toward Echo Valley that evening, Daniel reflected on how far he'd come from the lone sniper in Kandahar. He'd tried to leave that life behind, to find peace in simple ranch work. Instead, he'd found something better, a way to use all his skills, all his experience, to help others fight their own battles. The sun set behind them as Carson County faded in their rearview mirror, but Daniel knew they'd be back. Western Range wouldn't give up easily, and other corporations would try similar tactics elsewhere. But now they knew something important. In the light of day, with communities standing together, even ghosts could cast long shadows. 2 weeks after the Carson County showdown, Daniel sat in his ranch house kitchen, surrounded by maps, documents, and 3 laptops, displaying video feeds from various community monitoring stations. What had started as a local resistance had evolved into something larger, more organized, and potentially more dangerous. Another request from New Mexico, Sarah reported, adding a pin to the digital map projected on his wall. Small farming community outside Albuquerque. Corporate developers trying to condemn land for a technology corridor. Same playbook? Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. Similar. They're using urban expansion laws instead of water rights, but the pressure tactics are identical. Local officials suddenly find code violations, mysterious problems with equipment, subtle threats. The secure phone Fletcher had given him buzzed. Another update from DIA intelligence. Western Range's parent company had gone into damage control mode, publicly distancing themselves from their Carson County operations while quietly reshuffling executives and shredding documents. They're adapting faster than we expected, Daniel mused, studying the pattern of pins on the map, learning from each confrontation, changing tactics, trying new approaches. So are we, Sarah reminded him, gesturing to the monitoring stations. The network they'd built now covered 3 states, with local communities sharing information, resources and support. But we need to be careful. Success makes us a bigger target. As if to emphasize her point, Jake burst through the door, his usual enthusiasm tempered by urgent concern. Mr. Morgan, Got reports of unmarked helicopters doing low passes over the Martin spread in Echo Valley. Mrs. Martin says they're using some kind of scanning equipment. Daniel was already moving, checking the surveillance feeds. Sure enough, 2 black helicopters were making systematic sweeps over the valley, their flight patterns suggesting professional operators rather than corporate intimidation. Military grade, Sarah confirmed, studying the footage. Those aren't corporate birds, that's serious hardware. The radio crackled. Daniel? Maria's voice carried a mix of concern and confusion. We've got visitors at the dairy, different in kinds this time. They're asking about military contracts, something about strategic resource allocation. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. This wasn't corporate pressure anymore. This was something else entirely. He keyed his radio. Everyone maintained distance, no engagement. Jake, get me Fletcher on the secure line. But before he could make the call, his front door opened. Colonel Fletcher walked in, accompanied by 2 men Daniel didn't recognize, but instantly identified, the kind of serious-looking civilians who never quite managed to hide their military bearing. We have a situation, Fletcher said without preamble, one I'm afraid you may have inadvertently helped create. Daniel gestured for Sarah to close the laptops while studying the newcomers. Department of Defense. Among others, one of the men replied. What you've built here, this network of community defense and monitoring, it's caught some very important people's attention. Not all of it is welcome. Fletcher spread a new set of documents on the kitchen table. Western Range was just the tip of the iceberg. Their parent company has contracts with multiple defense contractors. Your success in exposing their operations has complicated certain arrangements. They were stealing people's land, Sarah said firmly, threatening communities, manipulating resources. Yes, the second man agreed, but they were also, unknowingly, helping maintain certain strategic assets. Water rights that affected military, installations, land parcels that contained sensitive monitoring equipment, communication networks that served multiple purposes. The implications hit Daniel like a physical blow. In helping communities defend themselves, they'd stumbled into a complex web of national security interests. The helicopters weren't conducting corporate surveillance. They were assessing potential security breaches. Your network, Fletcher explained, has become both a problem and a potential solution. You've shown these communities how to resist corporate pressure, how to maintain control of their resources. But in doing so, you've also demonstrated how vulnerable these areas are to organized resistance, including resistance from less friendly sources, the first man added meaningfully. Daniel looked at the map on his wall, seeing it with new eyes. Each pin marking a community victory also marked a potential security vulnerability. The very success of their methods had exposed weaknesses in systems they hadn't even known existed. What do you want from us? Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Partnership, Fletcher replied. Official sanction to continue your operations, but with additional oversight. Resources to expand your network, but with certain guidelines, protection for these communities that doesn't compromise national security. Daniel moved to his window, watching the helicopters make another pass over the valley. Everything he'd built here, the ranch, the community defense network, the new life he'd carved out, had been based on leaving his military past behind. Now that past was catching up in unexpected ways. And if we refuse, the second man's voice was carefully neutral. These operations will continue, with or without your involvement. The only question is whether communities will face these challenges alone or with the support network you've built. Sarah joined Daniel at the window, her presence both support and reminder. We could run, she said quietly. Disappear again. You're good at that. I'm not bad at it myself. But they both knew that wasn't really an option. The communities they'd helped, the people who'd trusted them, the network they'd built. It had all grown beyond their personal choices. "What guarantees do we have?" Daniel asked, turning back to Fletcher. "That these communities will be protected, that their rights will be respected?" Fletcher smiled slightly. "That's why we're here, Lieutenant. Your reputation, both as the Ghost and as Daniel Morgan, suggests you won't accept anything less. We're not asking you to compromise your principles. We're asking you to help us find a balance." The radio crackled again. Turner, this time, reporting more helicopter activity near the county line. "The situation was escalating whether they wanted it to or not. We'll need time to consider this," Daniel said finally, "and we'll need more information, full disclosure about what we're really dealing with." "Of course," Fletcher agreed, "but don't take too long. Those helicopters aren't just assessing, they're also sending a message. Others will have noticed their presence, drawn their own conclusions. The game is changing, whether we're ready or not." As if to emphasize his point, Jake burst in again, this time with printouts from various community monitoring stations. Reports were coming in from across their network. Similar aircraft spotted over other resistant communities, mysterious visitors asking questions about infrastructure and resources, sudden interest from federal agencies that had previously ignored. Local concerns. "It's happening everywhere," Jake reported, his young face serious. "People are scared, Mr. Morgan. They're asking what to do." Daniel studied the reports, then looked at the faces around him. Sarah, who'd fought beside him in more ways than one. Jake, who represented the future they were trying to protect. Fletcher and his mysterious colleagues, offering a devil's bargain wrapped in national security concerns. And somewhere out there, watching through high-tech sensors and sophisticated surveillance, were forces that saw their grassroots resistance as either a threat to be contained or an asset to be controlled. Tell them to maintain their observation protocols, he decided. No direct engagement, but document everything. And Jake, get Turner and Henderson on a secure channel. We need to talk about upgrading our detection capabilities. After the others left, Sarah stayed, her expression thoughtful. "You know what they're really asking, don't you? They want to turn your ghost into their ghost. Use what we've built for their purposes." "Maybe," Daniel agreed. "But maybe we can use them too. Get the resources and protection these communities need while maintaining enough independence to keep everyone honest." The helicopters made one final pass before disappearing toward the horizon, leaving Echo Valley in a silence that felt more ominous than peaceful. The world they'd helped create, of communities standing together against corporate pressure, had just become vastly more complicated. But as Daniel watched the sunset over his ranch, he realized that complexity might be exactly what they needed. In teaching others to defend themselves, they'd learned new ways to fight. In building networks of resistance, they'd created pathways for cooperation. The Ghost had evolved once, from solitary warrior to community defender. Perhaps it was time for another evolution. Night fell over Echo Valley, but there would be no rest. Daniel gathered his core team in the barn, converted now into a makeshift command center with computers, communication equipment, and surveillance feeds covering the walls. Sarah, Turner, Henderson, and Maria represented the original Echo Valley resistance. Jake managed communications, while Fletcher and his colleagues observed from the background. Latest intel from the New Mexico situation, Jake reported, pulling up satellite imagery. Those technology corridor plans, they're not just for corporate development. There's military infrastructure already in place, buried sensor networks, communication relays, something they're calling strategic monitoring assets. Similar pattern in Arizona, Sarah added. The water rights western range was trying to control. They overlap with classified installation perimeters. Someone's been using corporate land grabs to create security buffer zones. Turner cleaned his rifle, an old habit from his ranger, days that surfaced whenever he was thinking hard. So every time we helped communities resist, we were accidentally exposing these operations? Not accidentally, Fletcher interjected. You were showing exactly how vulnerable these systems are. Your community defense network demonstrated that determined local resistance could disrupt operations we thought were secure. And now others have noticed. One of Fletcher's colleagues added grimly. Those helicopters today? Chinese manufacture. Despite the American registration numbers, they're not the only ones interested in what you've built here. The implications hung heavy in the barn's air. Their success in teaching communities to defend themselves had inadvertently created a template that could be used by less friendly forces. We're getting more requests for help, Maria reported quietly. Not just from ranchers and farmers now, small towns near military bases, communities around research facilities, places that never cared about corporate land grabs before. Because they're starting to see the bigger picture, Sarah concluded, the connections between corporate pressure and government interests. Daniel studied the map of their network, seeing it with new understanding. Each point of resistance, each community they'd helped, represented not just a local victory, but a potential vulnerability in national security infrastructure. We need to make a decision, he said finally. Not just about Fletcher's offer, but about what we're really building here. What do you mean? Jake asked, looking up from his communications console. Think about it. We started this to protect communities from corporate bullies, taught people to watch, to document, to stand together. But what we've really created is a system for identifying pressure points in critical infrastructure. Understanding dawned on Turner's weathered face. A network that could be used to protect these assets instead of exposing them. Without sacrificing the communities themselves, Sarah added, catching Daniel's thinking. We already have their trust, their cooperation. Instead of fighting against government interests, we could help integrate them properly. Fletcher leaned forward. That's exactly what we're proposing. Your network stays intact, communities keep their independence, but with added layers of security and support. And oversight, Daniel reminded him, which brings us to the real question. Who watches the watchers? A new voice joined the conversation. Angela Chen, the water commissioner, from Carson County, appearing on one of the video feeds. Maybe that's where we come in, local officials who understand both community needs and national interests. Other faces began appearing on screens. Community leaders, local law enforcement, environmental experts. The network they'd built was already evolving, adapting to this new reality. It would need to be structured carefully, Sarah mused. Multiple layers of oversight, checks and balances. Keep the grassroots organization, but add professional security protocols. A true partnership, Fletcher agreed. Not government control, but cooperation. Your ghost becomes something new, a bridge between local communities and national security. Interests. Daniel moved to the barn door, looking out over his ranch. Somewhere in the darkness, those helicopters were probably still watching, analyzing and assessing. But now he saw them differently, not just as threats, but as reminders of how complex their world had become. Jake, he called, get me a secure line to every community leader in our network. It's time they knew what we're really dealing with. All of it? Fletcher asked sharply. That's classified information. Not anymore. Daniel's voice was firm. If we're doing this, we do it right. No more shadows, no hidden agendas. These communities have earned the right to know what they're part of. The next few hours were intense. Community leaders were briefed, questions answered, concerns addressed. Some were angry about the military connection, others saw the potential benefits. But all understood that their resistance had evolved into something larger than local land disputes. As dawn approached, Daniel found Sarah at the communications console, coordinating with their expanded network. Think we're doing the right thing? He asked quietly. She smiled slightly. The ghost becoming a bridge between shadows and light seems fitting somehow. Her expression turned serious. But we'll need to be careful. Power structures like this can be corrupted, turned against the very people they're meant to protect. That's why we maintain the community foundation, Daniel replied. Keep the power where it belongs, with the people who have the most to lose if things go wrong. The first rays of sun were painting the eastern sky when Fletcher approached with a new set of documents. If you're really doing this, there's something else you need to know. Those Chinese helicopters? They're not the only foreign interest we're tracking. He spread photos across the desk, satellite images showing similar community pressure tactics being applied in other countries. Corporate land grabs in South America, resource manipulation in Africa, infrastructure targeting. In Southeast Asia, your model works, Fletcher said simply. Others have noticed. The question is, do we let them keep copying it, or do we help other communities develop their own legitimate defense networks? Daniel shared a look with Sarah, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. The ghost had started as a solitary sniper, evolved into a community defender, and now stood at the threshold of something even larger. Get me everything you have in these international situations, he decided. And Jake, we're going to need a bigger communications setup. The sun rose fully over Echo Valley, illuminating a world that had grown both larger and more complex overnight. But as Daniel watched his team adapt to these new challenges, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. They had built something unique here, something that could bridge the gap between government power and community rights, between national security and local autonomy. The ghost was becoming more than a legend or a resistance leader. It was becoming a symbol of how communities could stand together, protect what mattered, and still be part of something larger than themselves. The Colombian coffee plantation looked nothing like Echo Valley, but Daniel recognized the familiar patterns of corporate pressure at work. Local farmers gathered in a small community center, their faces showing the same mix of determination and worry he'd seen in Texas ranches. They started 3 months ago. Miguel Santos, a third-generation coffee farmer, explained through Sarah's translation. First it was offered to buy, good money more than fair. When we refused, problems began. Equipment failures, mysterious fires, roads suddenly needing emergency repairs during harvest time. Daniel studied the maps spread across the table, noting defensive positions, key infrastructure, and vulnerable points. 6 months had passed since the revelation of their network's broader implications, and they'd spent that time carefully expanding their operation while maintaining its grassroots foundation. The company, Verde Futuro, they are not what they seem, Sarah added, reviewing documents on her tablet. Shell Corporation, same pattern we saw with Western Range, but the real players are different here. Chinese investors, Fletcher confirmed via secure video link, using South American corporations as fronts to acquire agricultural resources. They've done it in Brazil, Argentina, now here. Daniel watched through the community center's window as Jake worked with local youth, teaching them to set up and maintain surveillance equipment. The boy had grown in the past, months taking on more responsibility as their operation expanded. He wasn't the only one who'd evolved with the mission. They're security contractors? Daniel asked, though he already suspected the answer. Former Miss operatives, Sarah replied, referring to China's Ministry of State Security. Working through private military companies, they're learning from our playbook, using corporate proxies to maintain deniability. A young woman burst into the community center, speaking rapid Spanish. Sarah translated, Chinese helicopters like you warned about, making low passes over the northern plantations. Right on schedule, Daniel murmured. They'd seen this pattern before, aerial surveillance preceding more aggressive moves, but this time they were prepared. Jake, he called through the radio, activate the network. Across the valley, hidden cameras and sensors came online, their feeds displaying on monitors they'd set up in the community center. The system was a blend of military-grade technology provided by Fletcher's people and locally maintained equipment, creating a surveillance web that belonged to the community itself. Remember, Daniel addressed the gathered farmers, Sarah translating. This isn't about fighting. It's about making them realize they can't operate in the shadows anymore. Every move they make, every pressure tactic they try, all of it gets documented, shared, exposed. But they have powerful friends, Santos objected. Government officials who look the other way, judges who sign whatever papers they want. So do we, Sarah smiled, gesturing to another screen where Angela Chen's face appeared. The former water commissioner had become their liaison with a network of honest government officials worldwide. The Colombian Agricultural Ministry just received some very interesting documentation, Angela reported. Evidence linking Verde Futuro to illegal land acquisitions in 3 countries, environmental violations, tax fraud, connections to known criminal enterprises. Anonymous source? Daniel asked. Multiple sources, all legitimate, all verifiable. Amazing how much people notice when you teach them what to look for. The strategy they'd developed was working. Instead of direct confrontation, they were creating an environment where corrupt practices became too risky, too exposed to succeed. The Ghost's old skills, patience, observation, precise action, had been adapted to a new kind of warfare. Movement. At the north perimeter, Jake reported. 4 SUVs, same model Western Range used. They're maintaining distance, staying just within observation range. Let them watch, Daniel replied. Make sure our people are visible but non-threatening. Let them see exactly what they're dealing with. The corporate security teams would observe farmers going about their normal work, but they'd also see the cameras, the sensors, the communication equipment. They'd recognize the pattern from other failed operations, understand that this community was prepared and connected. Sarah joined him at the window, watching the helicopters make another pass. Different continent, same story, she mused. People just want to protect their homes, their way of life. But with better tools now, Daniel added, and a bigger support network. His secure phone buzzed. Fletcher with an update. Satellite shows more vehicles approaching from the south. Different profile, though. Government plates. Right on time, Sarah smiled. Angela's evidence must have hit the right desks. They'd learned to coordinate these operations carefully, revealing corporate misconduct to authorities at precisely the right moment, when their target was already committed, but hadn't yet taken irreversible action. It was like the sniper operations of Daniel's past, but with information as ammunition and timing as the critical factor. Santos, Daniel called to the lead farmer. Remember what we discussed. When the government investigators arrive, your people, provide full cooperation, show them everything, tell them everything. No threats, no accusations, just facts. The Colombian farmer nodded, understanding. They'd prepared for this, rehearsed it. His community would present themselves as innocent. Farmers being pressured by corrupt corporations, not as resistance fighters. It was a role they didn't have to fake. More movement, Jake reported. The Chinese security teams are pulling back. Looks like they got word about the government investigation. Daniel watched through high-powered optics as the SUVs retreated. They'd be back, probably with different tactics, different corporate fronts. But each failure made their job harder. Each exposed operation made the next one riskier. Sir? Jake's voice carried excitement. Getting messages from other communities in the region. They've been watching, seeing how we handle this. They want to know if we can help them set up similar systems. And there it was, the real victory. Not just protecting one community, but creating a model that could spread, adapt, grow. The Ghost's methods had evolved from individual action to community defense, and now to something even more powerful, knowledge transfer. Tell them yes, Daniel decided, but remind them of the principles. This isn't about fighting battles. It's about removing the shadows where corruption thrives. Community ownership, transparent operation, legitimate oversight. Sarah was already coordinating with Angela, arranging for legal resources and technical support. Fletcher's team would provide satellite coverage and intelligence. Local officials would be contacted, connections made, networks expanded. As sunset painted the Colombian mountains gold, Daniel reflected on how far they'd come from that first confrontation in Echo Valley. The skills that had once made him a legendary sniper now served a different purpose, teaching others to defend themselves, to stand together, to fight corruption with transparency rather than violence. The ghost was no longer a solitary figure. In the darkness, it had become a movement, a method, a way for communities to protect themselves while staying within the law. And as he watched Santos's people working with their new equipment, sharing knowledge with neighboring farmers, Daniel saw the next evolution already beginning. "Message from Echo Valley," Jake called out. "Turner says a similar corporate front just showed up in Arizona. Chinese investors again, different company names, but same patterns." "Here we go again," Sarah smiled. "Want to show them why they call you the Ghost?" Daniel checked his watch, calculating time zones and travel schedules. "No need. Turner's team knows what to do. Our job here isn't finished yet." Because that was the real power of what they'd built. It didn't depend on any one person anymore, not even the legendary Ghost. Communities around the world were learning to stand together, to resist corruption through organization and transparency, rather than force. The helicopters made one final pass before disappearing behind the mountains. In their wake, they left not fear, but determination. Another community had found its strength, learned to defend itself, joined a growing network of resistance against corporate corruption. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, other observers were watching, learning, adapting. The game would continue, but the rules had changed. The Ghost's evolution had shown a new way forward, turning shadows into light, turning solitary resistance into community power. As night fell over the Colombian highlands, the community center transformed into a hub of activity. Reports flowed in from across the region, other farming communities facing similar pressures, each one a potential new point in their expanding network. "Pattern analysis is interesting," Jake reported, pointing to his data screens. "Verde, Futuro isn't just targeting coffee plantations. Look at the property locations." Daniel studied the map, seeing what the boy had noticed. "They're creating a corridor, following the old smuggling routes through the mountains." "Not just smuggling routes," Sarah added, pulling up satellite imagery. "These valleys contain critical water sources. Control the plantations, control the water," Daniel finished. It was a familiar strategy, but with new implications in this terrain. Fletcher's face appeared on the secure video link. "Getting similar reports from Peru and Ecuador. Chinese front companies targeting agricultural properties along strategic routes. They're building a network of their own." "But why here?" Santos asked through Sarah's translation. "Our coffee is good, yes, but surely not worth all this trouble." "It's not about the coffee," Daniel explained, marking points on the map. "These mountains are natural corridors for movement, people, goods, information. Control these valleys, and you control access to significant portions of the continent." A new alert flashed across their screens. Movement detected on the access roads leading to the plantation, but these weren't the corporate SUVs from earlier. "Military vehicles," Jake confirmed. "The Colombian army looks like a full tactical unit." Daniel shared a look with Sarah. This was new. Usually government response was limited to investigators and regulators. Direct military involvement suggested the situation had escalated beyond their usual pattern. "Fletcher," Daniel queried. "Working on it," the DIA officer replied. "But preliminary intel suggests our Chinese friends didn't just alert their corporate backers about the investigation. They've made some calls to Beijing." Sarah's expression tightened. "They're forcing escalation, making this a diplomatic issue rather than a corporate one. The implications were serious. Their model worked well against corporate pressure and local corruption, but international diplomatic tensions were another matter entirely. "Sir?" Jake's voice carried concern. "Getting similar reports from our networks in Brazil and Argentina. Military movements near contested properties. It's coordinated." Daniel moved to the window, watching the Colombian military vehicles approach. This was the evolution of their opponent's strategy. If they couldn't win through corporate pressure, they'd escalate to national security concerns. "Options?" he asked the room. "We adapt," Sarah replied firmly, "like we did in Echo Valley, like we've done every time they've changed tactics." She was already moving to the communications center, coordinating with their expanded network. Angela, Chen's face appeared on multiple screens, along with other officials and community leaders from across the region. "The diplomatic angle gives us new opportunities," Angela pointed out. "International oversight, transparency requirements, multilateral observation missions. And we've got documentation of their entire corporate pressure campaign," Jake added. "Every illegal action, every threat, every connection to foreign intelligence operations." Daniel nodded slowly, seeing the shape of their response. "We make it bigger than they wanted, not just local land disputes or corporate acquisitions, but a full exposure of foreign interference in regional resources. Already reaching out to legitimate environmental and agricultural organizations," Sarah reported, "adding another layer of international observation." Fletcher's image nodded approvingly. "I'll coordinate with friendly military attachés in the region. Make sure the right people understand what's really happening here." Outside, the military convoy had reached the plantation's main gate. But instead of the aggressive response their opponents had likely hoped for, they found a community calmly going about its business, fully documented and completely transparent in its operations. "Santos," Daniel called to the farmer, "remember how we prepared for this? Your people maintain normal operations, everything open, everything documented. Let them see exactly what's here and what isn't." The Colombian farmer smiled grimly. "They expect to find weapons, contraband, and evidence of resistance operations. Instead, they find only coffee farmers protecting their homes." "Exactly." Daniel turned to Jake. "Make sure every camera is running, every sensor active. Record everything." As the military began their inspection, Daniel received another message from Fletcher. "Beijing's already backing down. Our release of the corporate corruption evidence has their diplomats scrambling to distance themselves from Verde Futuro." "They'll try again," Sarah warned. "Different companies, different methods." "Of course," Daniel agreed. "But now we have a new template. When they escalate to diplomatic pressure, we escalate to international transparency." The night deepened over the Colombian mountains, but the community center remained active. Reports continued flowing in from their network, similar situations resolving across the region as their model adapted to this new challenge. Jake, monitoring the communications, suddenly straightened. "Sir, getting requests from Asian communities. Now, farmers in Vietnam, villagers in Thailand, they're seeing what's happening here, asking if we can help." Daniel shared a look with Sarah, seeing the next evolution of their mission taking shape. The Ghost's methods had grown from individual action to community defense, from regional resistance to international network. Now they were becoming something even larger, a global model for standing against corruption and exploitation. "Tell them yes," he decided, "but make sure they understand. This isn't about teaching them to fight. It's about teaching them to stand together, to operate in the light, to turn transparency into power." As the military convoy eventually departed, finding nothing to justify diplomatic concerns, Daniel watched Santos's people begin their night harvest. They worked with quiet confidence, knowing they were part of something larger than themselves. The Ghost had started as a legend in the shadows, became a community defender, and now was evolving into something new. A symbol of how local communities could stand against global pressures while maintaining their integrity and independence. And somewhere in the darkness, observers were still watching, still learning, still adapting. But now they were learning a different lesson, that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a sniper's rifle or a corporate takeover, but the simple act of standing together in the light. The return to Echo Valley felt different this time. 3 months after the Colombian operation, Daniel's ranch had evolved far beyond its humble beginnings. The barn now housed a state-of-the-art command center monitoring situations across multiple continents. But more importantly, it had become a training ground. Vietnam team reports success, Jake announced from his expanded communication station. Corporate pressure stopped cold when they implemented our transparency protocols. Their local officials are already requesting training for other communities. Daniel watched through his window as Sarah led a group of visitors, community leaders from Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, through a practical demonstration of surveillance equipment. The Ghost's methods were spreading, but with each new application, they grew more sophisticated. Eastern Europe's getting interesting, Turner reported, marking new points on their global threat map. Russian oligarchs using similar tactics to what we saw in South America. Corporate fronts, resource manipulation, pressure on local communities. But different endgame, Fletcher added via secure link. They're not just after resources, they're creating instability, weakening local governance structures. The evolution of their mission had revealed larger patterns. What had started as corporate land grabs now showed itself as part of a global competition for resources and influence. But their response had evolved too. "Message from Angela," Sarah called out, entering with her training group. "That banking network we exposed in Colombia? Its traces led to similar operations in 15 other countries. International regulatory agencies are moving in." Daniel nodded, studying the latest intelligence reports. Their opponents were learning, adapting, finding new methods of applying pressure. But with each adaptation, they left new patterns to be recognized, new vulnerabilities to be exposed. A commotion outside drew their attention. A convoy of vehicles was approaching. Not the usual government or military transport, but expensive. Civilian cars, corporate representatives by their look. "Right on schedule," Fletcher commented. "Word of your training program has reached some interesting ears. These folks represent what they call concerned business interests." Daniel shared. A knowing look with Sarah. They'd been expecting this. Success brought its own kind of pressure. The question was, what kind of pressure would it be? The delegation that entered their command center was impressive. Executives from major international corporations, security consultants, even a former senator. Their spokesman, a silver-haired man named Harrison Wells, got straight to the point. "Mr. Morgan," he began, "or should I say Ghost, your activities have attracted significant attention in certain circles. We're here to discuss a potential partnership." "Partnership?" Sarah's tone carried polite skepticism. "Your methods are proving quite effective," Wells continued. "Perhaps too effective. You're disrupting legitimate business operations, interfering with necessary economic development. If by legitimate you mean corrupt," Turner muttered, but Wells pressed on. "We're prepared to offer substantial funding for your organization. Proper facilities, expanded resources, official recognition. All we ask is some discretion in how and where you apply your methods." The offer hung in the air like gunsmoke. Daniel moved to the window, watching Sarah's trainees continue their exercises. The Thai farmers were teaching the Malaysian villagers something about local surveillance techniques, while Indonesian community leaders shared their experiences with corporate pressure tactics. "Think you misunderstand what we're building here," Daniel said finally. "This isn't an organization you can buy or control. It's a movement based on communities teaching other communities how to protect themselves." "Admirable sentiment," Wells replied smoothly. But surely you understand the realities of global economics. Development requires resources, resources require land acquisition sometimes requires persuasion. Like what happened in Echo Valley? Jake spoke, up his young face hard. Or what your friends tried in Colombia? Wells' expression tightened slightly. Those were unfortunate situations, overzealous local operators. We're offering a chance to prevent such misunderstandings, to work within the system rather than against it. We already work within the system, Sarah countered. Legal documentation, transparent operations, legitimate oversight. That's the whole point. And when that transparency reveals corruption, Daniel added, when it exposes corporate crimes, government complicity, international manipulation of local resources, there are larger concerns at play, Wells insisted. National interests, economic stability, strategic resource management. Exactly, Daniel agreed. That's why what we're doing matters. Communities that can protect themselves, monitor their resources, maintain transparent operations. They're more stable, more resilient against all kinds of pressure. A new alert flashed across their screens. Movement at multiple monitoring sites across Southeast Asia. Corporate security teams, similar to what they'd faced before, approaching villages they'd recently trained. Speaking of pressure, Turner observed dryly. Wells spread his hands apologetically. Simply standard operational assessments. You've created quite a disruption in traditional development patterns. Certain interests need to understand their new operational environment. But Daniel was already moving, coordinating with their network. On screens around the command center, they watched as village after village responded exactly as they'd been trained. Full documentation, transparent operations, immediate notification of authorities and international observers. Operational. Environment, Daniel repeated thoughtfully. That's military terminology, Mr. Wells, like something Sullivan might have said. The executive's slight flinch confirmed Daniel's suspicion. Ray Sullivan was consulted regarding your methods before his unfortunate legal troubles. And now you're here to offer what? A chance to turn our network into a tool for corporate interests? To help you pressure communities more effectively? To bring order to a chaotic situation, Wells corrected. To establish proper protocols for resource development and land acquisition. Sarah's laugh was sharp. Proper protocols already exist. Environmental regulations, property rights, human rights laws. We just help communities ensure they're enforced. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.